how an adolescent, remember that's what we're talking about? We're talking about how an adolescent can grow into an adult. And if you recall, last week we started to summarize the material from England about the enormous difficulty that some adolescents have in growing into adults. And if you recall, we talked about the difficulty beginning around the beginning of puberty. We talked about the importance of talking with families and with adolescents about how they entered into adolescence around the 6th or 7th grade. A lot of times that's where the difficulty becomes impossible. Now, what we want to do is to connect that in a way in which when you're talking to, let's say, a 17-year-old, and you say to yourself, is this 17-year-old girl on the way to being an adult, or is she seeing herself as a broken adult, as an adolescent who is stuck but doesn't see herself as becoming an adult? Recall what we talked about last week about shooting up as opposed to growing up. The question is whether you're approaching adults as people that you're against. You can see what's the matter. You can see what's the matter with them, but you can't see how you're ever going to get to be an adult, as opposed to being on your way. Both of them, there's room for criticism. There's always room for criticism because nobody's perfect, right? So as generations grow, adolescents have something to say, but we're hoping that they have it to say in the sense of here's where I can make a contribution, and here's where I can become an adult as well, rather than saying, you guys have failed, and by the way, I'm going to fail too. So there are three components to it, and one doesn't exclude the other. And one of the important aspects of family systems thinking does not exclude other forms of thinking. Once you use the word system, what you want to do is try to imagine how things hold together. That's what the word system in Greek means. It means the way that things are put together. So there are three components that are put together. You want to understand each one of them well, and then when you understand each one of them well, you can see how they fit together. So the first one is the personal component, right? And there I just want to talk about one thing which we'll be getting to more as we go along. Okay. Let's talk first about the personal component. Now, here, when we're talking about individual development, education is a very important part of individual development. It's not as if psychotherapists think about feelings and it's left to educational people to think about education. How you perform in your education is extremely important. And the reason for that is a term that we need to learn about called sublimations, which I don't think you learned about with Barbara. Did you learn about it? Sublimations. Huh? Yeah? Maybe?
No.
Yeah.
Last year.
Last week. Oh,
Last year.
Last year.
Your presentation last year.
What's that?
Your presentation last year.
Last year. Okay. Well, not everybody was there, right? Is everybody was there last year? No. Okay. So, wow, somebody remembers. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sublimations are a notion that's based on developmental lines, which is something that I think Barbara did mention to you. Developmental lines, we look at the child, let's say a 12-year-old child, and we say, I don't think we did this yet, right? That there's a floor, walls, and a ceiling to development. We didn't talk about that yet, right? Okay, it's a very simple concept, but it has three parts. The average concept has 1.5 parts. When you go past 1.5 parts, it starts to look very complex, and then you close the book. It's not so complex, but it has 3 parts. There's the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. The floor of developmental lines are the way that you go about things from the time you're born. Some kids eat with gusto, and some kids will barely eat. Some kids will be very active, and some kids will be less active. Some kids will look for new things, and some kids will withdraw from new things. Those are characteristics of how people approach the world. Those are the floor of, you get that. Why do I call it the floor? Because it may be the basis, but you don't feel that it's really you. It's something that comes from you, but you haven't yet made it what we call ego is I, right? There isn't much I in the way things go about, because I haven't done anything to them, I just got them. That's where we get to the walls. And the walls is the coordination between the lines of development. Now, does that sound difficult? Here's an example. A 2-year-old is sitting at the table and wants choco. Now, you would think, if you're thinking instinctually, that the 2-year-old will be happy when she gets the choco, because that's what she wants. That's the line of eating. However, the 2-year-old points to the choco and says choco and is happy before she gets the choco. Why? Because she's connected two developmental lines. One is language, and one is eating. But when she connects the two together, see, it's a pretty simple idea. When you connect the two together, you have made a stitch in the walls of your development. You have made a stitch in creating the I, because I, and only I, can put together developmental lines. Everybody gets them, but it's only me that makes the stitches and puts them together. And if by some miracle the child points to the choco and says, choco, please, so not only are the parents excited that this has actually happened, but the child has done a double stitch. She's taken eating, language, and what's called object relations, dealing with people. Right? She said please, so she's relating to people aside from using language and in addition to getting some choco. You see how it works? So all of development goes about in making these stitches, and the most important of the stitches that you can make is something called sublimations. Now, a sublimation is it's a clumsy word, and maybe you can think of a better word for it. But the notion of sublimation is not a defense. You know, ego defense is when the ego wants to put something aside that feels like dangerous, something sexual or aggressive, then that's a defense, putting it aside. Sublimations are a way of putting, giving a different direction to the instincts. A different direction to the instincts. I'll give you an example of sublimations so that it's easy to understand. Anybody who's taught 8-year-old kids, and you see that you put up, you know, let's say 14 plus 17, that would be an 8-year-old, and the child both works at it, solves it, and his eyes light up. The eyes lighting up is the instincts. See, the eyes lighting up is pleasure. Where has it been stitched to? It's been stitched to the mind. Stitching instincts to the mind is what's called sublimation. And it makes your mind into something that gives you pleasure, right? And when your mind can give you pleasure, that's how you're creating sublimations. That's the most important of the walls of development, that your mind can give you pleasure. Now, why does your mind need to give you pleasure? Because otherwise you don't use it. You know, you can do it to make your parents happy, you can do it because that's what you do in school, but you won't enjoy it, it won't bring you anywhere. So creating sublimations is the most important part of the first 6 years of school. In other words, until 11 or 12, that's what goes on in school. And if it doesn't go on in school, in some cultures it goes on in the computer, in the phone, something where the child says, I nailed it and I loved it. And there was nothing physical nailed. It was all in your mind. That makes your mind into something that gives you pleasure. Why is it important to reach sublimations before the age of puberty? Because, you know the word latency? The word latency, which describes the school, the primary school years, doesn't mean that there's no instincts. Just, you know, go into the schoolyard and have a look and see, you know, who's doing what. There's a lot of instincts there. But the overall pressure of the instincts is less, and it leaves some extra room for thinking that isn't there when you get to be 12. When you get to be 12 and the instinctual forces start to become stronger, it's the balance between things. All of development is about balance, not about this or that. The balance, up until the end of Kagan, is in favor of the instincts. The balance during latency is like a little bit of a shift. We're just about to have elections. There's new elections. There's a new majority. The majority now is in favor of thinking. And then at 12, whoop, it shifts again. So you have those 6 years to get thinking to become instinctual. In other words, to give you pleasure. If thinking can give you pleasure by the time you're 12, then you will be an adolescent who's able to think. If thinking doesn't give you pleasure by the time you're 12, then you will be an adolescent who can't think, and then you can't become an adolescent. You'll stay a child. You see where this works? So you're building, stitching all the time, and whatever it is that makes you happy, thinking, that's what a sublimation is. The word sublimation means essentially refining something. In other words, you take something instinctual, which is sort of grosser or more physical, and you make it more spiritual or more involved in the human spirit thinking. Right? That's why the word sublimation is used. It's not a good term, but it's the coordination between the bodily pleasure and thinking. And that's what channels the drives. Instead of putting the drives away, like the fences do, sublimation is a way of channeling the drives so that your drives can give you pleasure thinking. Now, since it was there, in order to make those stitches, you need to be able to concentrate. How long does it take to make a stitch? Everybody who stitches knows that it doesn't take a second. It takes a little while to do it right, right? And the moments of consciousness are from 3 or 4 seconds on. That's when we pull something together in our consciousness. Things go by us and we remember them after about 1/10 of a second. But to do something with it involves what's called reentry. The brain creates these cycles in which something goes to the instincts, that's the amygdala, the limbic system. It goes up to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. It does a couple of circles around, and that takes a certain amount of time. It takes up between 3 and 4 seconds and 10 seconds. Now, let's say you have attention deficit, and you don't have 3 or 4 seconds. Let's say you only have 2 seconds, because then something else distracts you. So the re-entry is going to be interrupted. And for those children, the issue is not whether they sit in class and don't bother the teacher. The issue is one of development, which is how do you have enough time to make the stitches that allow you to make sublimation and to get something that channels the drives into thinking. Now, once you've done enough stitching, you become essentially a developmentally confident cloth maker. That's the ceiling. The ceiling of development, when you've done enough stitching, you say to yourself, I can do this. When something else comes at me, I can bring it into myself. The ego is capable of coordinating anything that comes in. See somebody, let's say now you're going to learn how to drive. So if you had enough sublimations and you say, well, I've never learned theory, let alone, driving on the street, but I can do it. Well, how do you know you can do it? You haven't done it before. Oh, because I've done all these other stitches, you see. And so I'm able to learn, and I'm able to, take the rules and figure out how to follow them, because I know how to follow rules. Because I've learned all these rules and I follow them. And I'm able to coordinate my body, so I'm going to be able to steer and brake, which are important things to learn how to do. And so you have somebody who says, I can continue to develop. That you need in order to be an adolescent, right? So if you don't have those, and you get to the age of 12, that's the individual component that would say, can't do it. There's lots of instincts. I'm just going to hang out and, either eat or not eat or deal with my body all the time. I'm going to be broken, but I can't get to be an adult because I haven't made the ceiling. The ceiling is where you have the ability to continue to stitch. That's one of the things you need to be able to become an adult. So far, so good? So now we've learned about the personal part, which is sublimations, and to some extent about the family aspect of it. Because what's the role of the parents? The role of a parent is to say, how are you developing? Is there anything more important for a parent than how are you developing? Children need help in developing. So a parent who's busy stitching together with their kid, when you read a book to your kid, and the kid is happy to remember what happened in the page, the next page, and the eyes light up, you're stitching with them. You're saying it's great to be smart. It's great to, you know, this is just the mind. Great comes from the instincts. It's great to be smart. It's great to know things. That's helping the child to develop. So family is important. Some kids can do it all on their own, and some kids need more or less help to be able to create that sublimations.
I'm wondering if all thinking is equal. In other words, the kid who's on the device all the time, and he's very good at games and solving all sorts of stuff, but he can't read a book, listen to a book, can't. Is he going to be able to sublimate?
Right. Well, we don't know the answer to that. In my experience, there are some kids that the computer saves. You know, some kids go to school and it's just, you know, something doesn't work. But when they go home and they play with Fortnite is the latest of the aggressive but very complicated interactive games that the kids play, and says, I can do it. You see them in Fortnite with their eyes glowing. They just beat the sky in Hong Kong. You know, that they were, and they say to themselves, they're making stitches. Now, you would like them to make some other stitches, right? But the last thing you want to do is to say, take off those stitches. Those aren't good stitches. There are no not good stitches, right? When you build in your mind, whatever works, works, then you would like to be able to generalize it. But if you say to yourself, okay, we're living in a world where these things exist. Now, one way to do it is say they don't exist, right? We have only books and you don't have a phone. That's one strategy. The other strategy is to say, there's something even better than that. That's terrific. And now there's something even better than that. But that engages us as adults in thinking, how do we make our kids excited about what we want them to be excited about? There's more competition than there used to be. But the competition is pretty cheap. In other words, if you think you have something really great, so then you need to make it great for the kids. And that's an educational question. Saying to the kids, you're no good because you're not learning the way I learned 30 years ago, that's a little weaker. Yeah?
That was actually my question in terms of the kid who's not making this connection. What's like the parental influence, or like what's going on in that family?
Right, so the kids may not be making connections if it's a family that doesn't think. See, every time a kid sees a family thinking together, we're going to get to that in a minute, you'll see that the child is saying, huh, look at that. You take this, you know, you have these feelings, like, you know, somebody didn't pick up their socks, so there were feelings about it, right? And so, and then there are these feelings, and then there's this thing called language, and people talk about it, and it works. Look at that, you know, so it's worth being able to talk, it's worth being able to think, it's worth being able to talk together, because if that's what they see. If they see that language doesn't solve anything, and that language just is a fight, and it's better not to use language because the words are like fists and not like thinking, then language is against sublimating. And so, you know, the family environment will be one that will be important in that way. So that's the first part.
The stitches and these lines. So it takes 3 to 4 seconds to sublimate. Is that meaning if you do something good, you're proud of yourself? So then you think about it for 3 to 4 seconds, you're sublimating, and then that's what takes the time. Meaning,
right. You're creating a structure in your brain. Those stitches are now. What does that mean? Structure? You're creating cells in your brain. Nobody thinks about the brain that way now. People think about patterns of communication between functions in the brain. There used to be, and maybe you were taught in your bachelor's or your master's, depending how updated things were, that, you know, the source of the emotions is the amygdala. Very weak science. What we know now is the question is not what's the source of emotions, but how does it get coordinated? right? In other words, when you feel something, where else does it go? It just doesn't sit there and do nothing, right? It may go straight to your hand, right? Or it may go up to your mind and you start to psychoanalyze yourself for 15 minutes before you do anything. Or it may go up into your mind and not come back and you start to obsess about it and don't do anything, right? But the patterns of communication, that's what you're creating when you're sublimating. What you're doing is making another stitch, another pattern of a feeling and a thought, and the thought makes the feeling even better, right? And so you go into global kinds of patterns, and that's where the I is, and the patterns that I'm used to having, right? So that's a better way to think about it probably than the concrete matter way of looking at it. All of brain science is going more to patterns of communication. It's energy. It's not matter. It's not something sitting there. It's things that move around, and that you can move them around, and that's what you're doing. So now, when you say that, okay, I can sublimate. Sublimate is just talking about where the sort of a general direction, that there are urges and they make you happy in thinking. That's nice. Let's just think about thinking for a minute and see what else we can understand about it. Now, this brings us, for those of you who ever tried to read Wilfred Bion, it's worth doing just to make you think that Lynn Hoffman is evil. Wilfred Bion was a British psychoanalyst from the Kleinian school who pioneered creating a new vocabulary that tried to put thinking processes into psychoanalysis. And he managed to do it in a way that is so obscure that it wasn't clear that he understood what he was talking about. But things develop over time. That's life with pioneers, right? You have a new Einfall, and you don't have language to put it in, and it takes a while to sort of, make it work. So if you take what's central to Bion, it's in this term mentalization. And mentalization is the leading term in development and in psychoanalysis now, and it's crucial to understanding adolescence, because this is what you do with sublimations. What do you actually do when you think? So mentalization means using your mind. And we can say that in English and in Western languages, it's very hard to find a way of saying it in Hebrew. But here we are in English, so it's easier. The Hebrew translation for mentalization is mentalizatia, because there's no exact, precise Hebrew term for mind. It's a Greek way of thinking. We have other ways of thinking, and there isn't a Hebrew term for mind. So much so that when you needed to have the word mind translated in philosophy, the Arabs had a term. They had akal. Akal in Arabic is exactly mind. That's how it got worked out. That was translated in the Middle Ages as sechel. There wasn't a better word for it. But in the Middle Ages, when they say sechel, what they mean is mind. But in modern Hebrew, that doesn't work. So anyway, we have mentalization. Now, the important part of mentalization is the world doesn't stay as it is. You see, at first, when we approach the world, there's something called the psychic equivalence. Psychic equivalence is a very simple way of seeing that it is the way it is. In other words, nothing could be any different. It's just whatever it is, inner feelings, outer feelings, right? Let's say, for example, that I'm feeling that I'm not being paid attention to. It happens to people who give lectures every now and then. And so let's say I have this feeling that I'm not being paid attention to, but I'm sure that you're not paying attention to me. I'm sure. Now, how can I be sure? I haven't even asked you yet. How am I sure? Because of the psychic equivalence. That's what I feel, that's what it is, right? So then I can't think about it. And then I say, well, you people aren't paying attention, goodbye. And everybody says, what was that all about? And the answer is, wasn't well analyzed, needs more treatment. Mentalization is where the inner and the outer are separate. It raises a question. It's not an answer, it's a question. So when you can have two things, the inner and the outer, and you say they're not the same, I'm feeling that nobody's paying attention to me. I wonder what the class is thinking, right? So then, that allows me to think about, that's what mentalization is, the outer and the inner. And then I can begin to make an integration. See the term integration, coordination of the lines, right? There's something out, there's something in. I'm trying to do something that allows you to play with it. play is a crucial notion in mentalization, because play means I wonder. It doesn't mean I know, it means I wonder. And if you've ever heard therapists talk, it's a word that, you grow into it and then you grow out of it. After a while, you don't use it anymore. But for the beginning, you say, I wonder, endlessly. And when you say, I wonder, what you're trying to do is to create mentalization. And you're doing it not just by yourself, you're hoping to have the client join you in wondering, right? So let's wonder together. Let's say that there's something that between the inner and outer, there's a question rather than an answer. It isn't just how it is. And so let's have a look at it. So wonder is also the origins of philosophy. Every philosophical system begins with wonder, in the sense that you look at the world with wonder. You have a question, right? If you have a question, it's really hard to go into philosophy. So you never get out of the questions. Good philosophy is just a continuation of questions. So we have questions too, and we want our clients to have questions. And when we say, I wonder, we're kind of hoping that we're not the only one in the room that's wondering. We're sort of inviting them to wonder, because actually mentalization is not an individual process. When Peter Fonagy, who's the psychoanalyst in London, developed this notion, he developed it mainly as an individual, as what goes on inside a person. But it really hardly ever goes on just inside of a person, because the other person is the outside. So we wonder together. So we create wondering, and that's what allows this playfulness that we call mentalization. What would be then the definition of trauma? Trauma is an experience that doesn't allow us to wonder. It overwhelms us with the feeling and doesn't allow us to ask what is it about. Right? And so post-trauma treatment a lot of times begins with wondering, with taking the experience in slow motion and looking at it, how else might it be? What other thoughts might you have? See, let's say you're near a missile that falls, and just, you're 4 years old, and just before the missile fell, you were about to try to push your baby brother over the stairs. Just before the missile fell, and then the missile fell, right? So obviously, that 4-year-old is sure you can figure it out, right? And then they're going to be frightened, not of the next missile, of themselves. And so the meaning got created, and there wasn't time to think about it. So you open up the package. And that's true of families in the South, where the missile fell just before the husband was about to say to the wife, I really can't stand you. I'm so angry with you. And then the missile falls and everything. And so the couple becomes distorted by the trauma, right? So in trauma, where there's no way to open the questions, that's what we do in the psychological treatment of trauma. You say, what is this about? A woman is raped, and then, she's overwhelmed with feelings. But those feelings also include all sorts of automatic notions about herself. The most famous one is, I must have done something wrong, it's my fault. And there's lots of men out there who will tell her that's the case. And so part of the treatment is to break it apart and say, that's what you thought at first. I wonder if we could, see, until you open up what's been closed. And that's true of a great many smaller traumas in families, and that's why kids, when things seem a little bit too much, they stop thinking. And that's where the need for therapy begins, with these automatic. So, mentalization, if we're thinking about adolescents now, in order to do mentalization, you have to have sublimations. If the feeling creates an automatic response, you're not mentalizing. You're in the psychic equivalent, right? Which means you can't think about, I wonder how this family is functioning. I wonder what my role is. I wonder how it could change. So we're talking about an adolescent who's gaining reflective function, symbolization, foresight. Foresight means you can think one step ahead. Geniuses think 3 steps ahead, but you need to think 1 step ahead. If I do this or if I do that, right? And an awareness of the inner state, my inner state, and the inner state of somebody else. You see where families function that way? You say, okay, so you're angry at him, and what else could I be feeling? And what, I don't actually, the truth is, I don't quite understand. I don't understand you. You're saying an adolescent is, doing it with his father, and the adolescent says, I don't understand what's going on inside of you. I get what you're telling me about me, but I don't understand you. That's reflective. That's talking about an awareness of an inner state of the self and other, right? And that's where things can grow. To do that, you have to have secure attachment you learned about with Barbara. If attachment is insecure, what happens? You don't mentalize. It is the way it is. It's either anxiety-provoking, or you cling, or you run away. And the important part is that the as-if means that you can play. You can say, are you screaming at me because you couldn't sleep last night? Maybe you're just tired. And that's, mothers do that all the time. When the kid is, doing his thing at the age of 4.5, and you say to the kid, you need a nap, what is that doing? You're mentalizing for him, saying, you're not being a bad boy, you're being a very tired boy. So I'm going to help you to solve that problem. And if it's right, that's good. And if it's wrong, it's not so good. It's not always needing a nap. Sometimes something else, but a lot of times it's needing a nap. Gabriel?
Well, two things. What is this last thing you said? It's not so good.
Oh, but
What is create?
see, knowing the awareness of the inner state of the other is always a question. Mothers are afflicted with the fact that they often know the answer, but not always knowing the answer. A good mother doesn't always know the answer. She guesses right some of the time. And when she doesn't, she sees that it's wrong. It's, I say afflicted because sometimes you get addicted to knowing this stuff. And so the kid, has appendicitis and you tell him he needs a nap, so he's missed it. You've sort of been addicted to the inner state of saying that you need a nap and not noticing that he's holding the right lower quadrant of his belly and vomiting. And that's not what he needs.
As you get older, it can lead to emotional.
What's that?
As you get older, it can lead to emotional understanding of the child.
Of all kinds, yeah. All understanding is more of a question than an answer. But if it's only a question, kids don't feel very secure, right? Kids need parents who know some stuff sometimes, but don't know everything all the time, because they have to have some room to work it out together, to mentalize, to learn how that works.
So before the first question is trauma. What did you say that trauma was?
Trauma is where you can't mentalize. The common way of talking about it is to say that trauma is where there's a flooding of the emotions which closes down the ego. It overwhelms the ego. That's another way of saying that something's happening to you that you can't recycle. You can't do reentry in your brain with it. It's created something that is automatic. And so there's no ego there. Trauma is where the ego is not, right?
There's no ego.
What's that?
The ego's been removed.
The ego's been removed and needs to retrieve that's what we do in what's called prolonged experiencing. That you go through the trauma in slow motion. Why? Just to feel lousy again? Who wants to go through that? The first thing you do with trauma is you avoid it, right? So why do you go over it again? To allow the ego to metabolize it, to mentalize, to think about it, to create other ways of, if you want to think about it, other forms of the connectivity in the brain. So it's not just the one pattern that says, I'm guilty, or I'm no good, or I can never do anything right, or so forth. Now, the next component, so yeah.
With trauma, my question is, if someone is able to already mentalize at a higher level, does that mean they will be less affected by a particular trauma?
Now, there's a very useful question, right? If a family is able to mentalize together, does that mean that the family does better when they're approached? The answer is yeah. In other words, we're going to get to the fact that we say, well, what does it mean a family can mentalize together? It means they can recreate things. They can do things that are new. They can create patterns that work better in a new situation. And a new situation is what happens every morning when you wake up. There's a new situation. Something in developing families you know, one of the kids is a little different than he was yesterday. So, and there's a lot of kids, so there's more differences, all right? The more you can think about that, the better you can create with it. The less well you can think about it, the more that you try to keep it the way it was.
Right, but that's like after the event.
What's that?
That's after the event, when
Right.
the family could mentalize together, that's going to happen. I'm just wondering, like, if in the moment, the person will be less affected by the trauma because their brain is already able to mentalize, they're less likely to get caught in that one,
Right.
like, sickness.
Well, I'll give you an example. Hopefully it's a good example. It's from my family. When we were under attack in 1991, what was called the first Gulf War. So there was this crazy business, you know, that the missiles were going to be having gas in them. You had to put on gas masks. You probably don't remember that, right? Anybody remember it? You guys remember it? Wow. Right. So yeah. So this was a pretty crazy thing to do, you know. And the idea that there's going to be this, you know, missiles with gas coming down. First of all, we were in Beersheba. Nobody was shooting at Beersheba, but you know. So we went into
Sealed room.
no, it was before the sealed rooms. The sealed, no, it was, we were going into the bomb shelter that was also sealed. And, right, and so we had to put on gas masks. Now, putting on a gas mask for, you know, kids that are 5 and 3, that's not, that feels, you know. So what we did is, before we put on our gas mask, we gave Saddam Hussein a raspberry. We went, Saddam Hussein, then we put on our gas mask. Now, that's an example of, I hope it's an example, my kids still remember it well, that you're saying we're playing with it. In other words, there's an I, there's an ego here that's beyond Saddam Hussein. As we say in Hebrew, katana leil. We're not afraid of him. That's how you show somebody contempt. And then you can put on the gas mask, which means you're scared out of your mind, right? So if that gives you an example of how, you know, when something's happening, the more that you say we can handle it by doing something, by creating something. A lot of times it's something funny, but something that only you can create, so that allows you to see it as something you can handle. Yeah.
This whole topic is reminding me of like narrative therapy. So I actually did that with a client, and it's so interesting that that's actually what you do. You take apart every trauma afterwards, and then you can actually think about it from a different place. Like someone
Right.
holding the pain.
Narrative therapy came into the world at about the same time as mentalization in completely different areas. But narrative therapy is based on most of these ideas. The question that we'll get to later on in the course is, do we have a client who can engage in narration? Engaging in narration requires sublimations, requires certain relationships, you know, it requires a certain mentalization. For people who can do narrative therapy, as we say, because hey, that's a good thing to do, we'll see that it is necessarily possible for everyone. That's another question. So now, here we're going to stitch together. That's what we're doing today. We're stitching things together. So we talked about what it is that a kid needs, and we've redeemed the terms sublimation as a form of coordination of developmental lines. And we've talked about mentalization as the way in which you can look at using your noggin once you have it. Now, the adolescent at 12 is living in a family, right? And if we look at the family, and this will be a brief review of things that you can hopefully say to yourself, I know that already. I'm trying to give you some pleasure, right? A little bit of sublimation. The 11 or 12-year-old needs to grow out of the role of the child and into the role of an adolescent on the way to being an adult. If you say to yourself, the way I treated you 3 years ago is good enough, why shouldn't I do it now? You're in trouble, because he was 8, he's 11, he's going to be 15. Why should that stay the same? He's not the same. Why should the relating be the same, right? So within the global context of kibbutz av, there's room for people to grow. They have to grow, otherwise how can they grow? So you have to recreate kibbutz av in a way that allows the child also to become a member of the family in a different way. And that's what we call the crossroads of differentiation in the adolescence. The main point of this is that not only does the child need sublimations and mentalization, the child needs a family who says, we can handle, because the child growing up is a bit of a trauma too, right? We can handle your growing up. We can talk to you in ways that continue to grow with you. You can continue to have a role that continues to grow with you. If the family can do that, then we have an adolescent that can move ahead. If the child feels in the family, this family needs me as a child. I have thoughts and I have mentalization, but I'm not going anywhere, because every time I try to do something that feels more like on the way to an adult, things get too tense at home. And so the family can't incorporate me. That would be another reason for adolescent breakdown, for stopping development. So here's the stuff that you already know. The differentiation, we're dealing with the eye position, triangles, and co-creation. Sounds familiar? At least familiar, right? So we would say that in high differentiation, there's a relationship of each child that changes over time. There's co-creation in the dyad with the father, there's co-creation in the dyad with the mother, and there's co-creation in the dyad of the couple. That's what's called a triad, that's not a triangle, right? So there's room for, and then which one grows when? It depends, there's no rules for that. But the child has a different talk with his mother about difficulties with a friend, and then the mother co-creates, because when she's talking to her daughter about difficulties with friends, well, she remembers herself with her difficulties with friends, and she grows in a way, is talking to the child, and she brings that to her husband because he's her best friend, but it's related to how much she trusts friends. And the father has another different way of dealing with the girl after he sees that something is on the move. That's a triad. There's room for creation in all the dyads, not all at once, right? This isn't science fiction, that everybody co-creates all at once. It happens when it happens, but you're minded to it. You say, what else is going to happen? These things happen, at the kitchen table just before benching kacha, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but they happen. Whereas in a triangle, the child feels, for example, if I start to talk differently to my father, my mother starts to yell at him. That's not going to work. Or if I ask my mother for things I haven't asked her before, then father gets remote from her and sees that she's busy with me and she's not interested in him. So I better just stay the same, right? That's going to be an obstacle to growing up. Just you recall, I hope, which is that if we're talking about differentiation, there'll be two. Remember this? If you remember this, you get a B on the course just for remembering this. That there are two strategies of not co-creating. One is moving away, and one is swallowing each other. And they're both strategies of not engaging in co-creation. And so you have some families that are mainly what are called disengaged, and some families that are mainly enmeshed, but you'll see some families that seem to alternate between one another, which means that they're both strategies. They're not mutually exclusive strategies of low differentiation. Low differentiation is not differentiated, so you're not so the expert. But the point is to get to the point where there can be co-creation. So a family where the child talks to the father and the father moves away, so that's moving away from co-creation. But when he talks to his mother, she swallows him up and says, let me tell you exactly what it was for me. And by the end of the conversation has been 15 minutes of a rant about something, but the child said, but I was talking to you about my friend, not about you. So that would be a test. Can it happen in the same family? Sure. Okay? But the point is that there could be co-creation in the dyads within the family, not easily achieved. Not easily achieved. The child becoming an adolescent is rocking the boat. And he knows he's rocking the boat. So it's a real paradox, isn't it, right? You're no longer a child. So life should be easy in the family now because you're no longer a child. But by becoming not a child, you're rocking the boat. The family is used to your being a child. And this I think you know about, the differentiation. Where there's high, there's place for the co-creation, and when there's low, then everything stays the same. The we doesn't change. In the change from the role of the child, there's a change in the role of the parent. There has to be, right? The Av isn't written in stone. Human beings are not written in stone. Being a father means being a father who is the father that helps this particular child at this time to grow, not the father who helped this particular child 3 years ago to grow. Being a father means, and how do you help a child to grow? You have to change your own role. Because telling him what it is different from listening to how he thinks it's different and appreciating it and helping him to grow. It's all of it. It can be in the framework of kibbud, but what we were hoping for a child is an increase in differentiation. But it's not such a surprise, that many families seem to be doing okay until the first child or the first challenging child gets to be 12 or 13, and then things get difficult. And it may be that that particular child is becoming symptomatic, and it may be the 5-year-old who's refusing to go to Gan, but something is happening in the family that didn't happen before. And if you look, you see there's a decrease in differentiation. People are threatened, and so they say to the whole family, let's not go there. Go where? Forward. Like, let's not go to, you're going to become an adult. That's not going to work for us. We need you to be a child. And so it's hard for the differentiation to stay the same, because if you're creating something you haven't created before, differentiation is going up. You're doing new co-creation. That's what's required in adolescence. If you're stopping the co-creation, you can't freeze a family. What you do is you lower the differentiation, because up until now, the child was getting developmental nutrition that was appropriate for him. And now he's not, right? So the I position of the child, which was, I'm a child and I'm learning and you're helping me to learn, that's good, becomes, I'm an adolescent and I can't develop. So differentiation has gone down. That child, his developmental position no longer has an I position. Yeah.
How would you describe a situation where it's the opposite, where the child is being pushed to grow up too quickly?
Same thing. If the child that's where you often get a pseudo-adult. In other words, you say to the child, okay, you're a big girl, you're 7, and you have 3 or 4 siblings beneath you, let's act like a big girl. Now, some girls will say to themselves, oh, that's a great stitch, I can do that, that'll be marvelous. And some girls say, I can't pull that together, but I can pretend, right? And by pretending, you lose the I position, and then you become a little too good, and it falls apart at some later point. So it's not surprising that when we're seeing an adolescent, we're seeing a whole family that's dealing with adolescence. And as you saw when we did the exercises before, that the family, usually the parents are re-experiencing what didn't work so well for them in their own adolescence. As a matter of fact, this is what's called a smart kick. In other words, if you look at adolescence and see what it is they're demanding of their parents that the parents aren't able to do, and you just ask the parents, were you able to do that when you were 15? The answer is me? My parents? No, I couldn't do that. So that's what's called a smart kick. The kid is kicking you exactly where you stopped. So it's not just for the child. It turns out to be for you too. They have a feeling that this is where you stopped, and where you said, I can say certain things, this I can't say. Remember we did an exercise of that? So your kid says to you what you couldn't say to your parents. And then you say, oh, I could never say that to my parents, so that must be wrong. Or you can say, what am I doing right? That my kid can say to me what I couldn't say to my parents. Let's grow. That doesn't happen often. When it happens, it often happens in therapy. That's one of the roles that we have, is to help people to see the kick as a challenge to develop further. So for those of you, I think I showed this to you once, right? So we'll go on.
Could you remind us what it is? What does the picture mean?
What's that?
What does the picture mean?
What does the picture mean? Well, the picture never means, but we can play with the picture. The first time I taught Bowen, it was an art therapist who brought this in. This is Escher, and what you see is an impossible structure. Escher plays with reality. Escher is a good example of mentalization. He makes you think. That's why we don't say the answer, but we can get the question, right? So the way I use it is to say, well, here's a family where you're climbing up, you think you're climbing up to be inside, but you end up being outside, right? And the only thing that really is, and people are looking out in different ways. Everybody has a different eye position, but nobody's talking to each other, except these two people who seem to be going, we don't know where.
Who are the ones climbing up, the therapists?
So that you can choose for yourself. This is just a picture. Now, Escher hadn't learned family therapy, and they certainly hadn't learned it from me. So I'm just bringing it in because sometimes the real reason I bring it in is for this part. This is the bottom, right? This is the only part that really is stable, right? Here's where Escher takes reality, the next one. And so what I thought is that here's low differentiation. You're caught. You can't move. You don't look too happy, do you? Right? In other words, low differentiation is a form of suffering. It's a form of a prison where you can't imagine how on earth you could get out of it. So if you look at that face, it's nuts. Escher doesn't have too many faces like that. That's concrete. That's suffering from low differentiation. But look how stable it is compared to everything else. It's absolutely, it's safe. You're stuck. You're suffering, but it's safe. And here I thought, this you could take to be the adolescent. See, it's the same. If you stay as a child, you're stuck here. But if you put on your thinking cap and you say, there's a structure, and see what a mentalization is? We're just playing with the picture. This is not Escher, right? But see what a mentalization is? This is mentalization. But this is a structure, and this is a structure, and they don't seem to fit. So we have to sort of play with it. But look where we are. We're out free. We're able to contemplate. And this is how an adolescent grows. And the adolescent who doesn't grow is not a happy camper, even if he pretends to be. And the adolescent who is growing is not a done deal, right? It's not finished. You don't have the answer yet. The viewer doesn't have the answer for what's about these two structures that don't fit. That's being an adolescent. That's mentalizing. If you look, you see there's a certain amount of pleasure in thinking about a problem, right? So that's the sublimation. And it could be that that happens first, and then when that problem is raised, this structure becomes possible. But that's one way of doing it. Anybody have another idea? It's a picture, so usually it has, I'll tell us about 15 different meanings.
I'm thinking there's some reality to the prison, like the structure itself is very, like you're saying, you think you're going upstairs to go inside, but it's really outside.
Right.
Whereas the prison is, I guess, like a reality, like
Right.
when you're in a prison, you're...
Right. Being a prisoner means you're inside, right? You're safe. Nothing can confuse you. Nothing can make you think. It is what it is, right? That's sort of the inner and outer is the same. Right. Okay. So now we have the social. We have components. How does the kid get stuck? See, when we think with families, we say, oh, I think we have an adolescent who's having a breakdown here. Breakdown in the sense not of hospitalized, but stopping movement, right?
What I can't hear you.
What's that?
I didn't hear you.
The word breakdown in this sense means stopping movement. You see, a car breaks down, you can say the car is breaking down, it means it stopped moving. Or it could mean some thinking over the inner structure that's all, that it's out of oil and things are burning the gaskets and so forth. But the simple meaning of breakdown is it stopped moving. We don't know why, right? It stopped moving. So the breakdown here, we're thinking, how did the child develop? What kind of sublimations and what kind of mentalization is possible? We're thinking about the family, and is the family able to cross to the crossroads of differentiation and to put together a higher level of differentiation. And then you have to ask socially what's expected of an adult, right? And here you reach multicultural studies. You say, in your own communities, what is expected of an adolescent? You say you're about to become an adult, at what rate, what's expected of you, and how do we help you to get to believe that you can become an adult in our community and that our family can incorporate an adult in our community, and that things will work out. So it depends. You see, these four aspects. It's some sort of studying the work in Israel, those who go to the army. That's a whole different story. Right? It's a whole different adolescence if you're thinking about risking your life for 3 years before you become an adult. There's the issue of sexuality, which will obviously be very different in secular and in Haredi communities, but it has to be addressed. Right? Where does sexuality grow? How does it grow? And when you get married, which is very different between Haredi and secular society. So you say, for my society, what are the pieces? You know, for the boys, it's obvious that studies is more important than anything else for a while. And for the girls, perhaps marriage is more important than the other things for a while. But you see what the puzzle is. You say, what kind of an adult are we putting together? I don't give you those answers. Each of you in your own community. You know, you say, what's the puzzle? What's an adult? And how do we help adolescents to have enough mentalization, enough sublimations, enough room in the family that the family can incorporate the person becoming an adult, and give them a map of what is an adult that works in this community. Okay. Now, one additional way of looking at it, which is helpful in understanding adults, comes from this guy named Robert Kagan. Kagan obviously was once Cohen, right? So.
Another Jew, basically.
Right, there's no H in Russian. So, you know, the Chafetz Chaim was Kagan, because there's no H in Russian. So you go to the Gospital, where you undergo hypnosis and so forth. So Robert Kagan, probably 3 generations removed from that, was a very important psychologist in Boston, who had an extraordinary way of writing. After he wrote his first book, which was well received in certain circles, his father said to him, he came to his father and said it was translated into Japanese. His father said, oh, well, that's wonderful. When are you translating it into English? So I can read it. But I'll give you sort of the gist of it. Kagan suggests that at the beginning, the me, see we're talking about the ego, that the me is inside the body. Those of you who remember somatosensory stage in Piaget, that means that what you do and what you feel is all of you. The you is inside the body, and that grows to a situation where the ego includes the body. It's about 1.5 years, 2, where a child can feel that if it's a knee that they fell on, that it's their knee, that it's my knee. Before that, they don't talk too much, but the experience is that there's this knee that's bigger than I am. It's hurting, and I'm inside of the body. At about somewhere between 1 and 2, a child starts to feel that, this is my body, and it's my knee that's hurting. It's easy to understand that in the next stage, which goes on from 2 to 11, where there are feelings, right? So let's say you're angry. Well, the average kid in Gan who is angry, he's not saying, I'm angry. So you made me angry, right? So this anger is bigger than I. The feelings, I'm small, I'm in the feelings. And when we talk to kids, endlessly talk to them about what you're feeling, it's your feeling, it's if you're angry. Well, they don't quite get it at first, but the idea is that there's an I who can include now, it's a pretty big I now, it includes, if you think about sublimation, stitching together, it includes my body and my feelings, right? And then we get to adolescents who have thoughts, but the average 12 or 13-year-old, when you ask her what she's thinking, she says, well, this is what's right. It's not what I'm thinking, it's what's right. The school should be run this way. There's nothing else to talk about. This is it. Because when you're an early adolescent, your thoughts are bigger than you are. They think you. And then that later becomes, and we like to say here that women around the age of 20, men sometime before 120, get to the point where I've had a thought, and what are you thinking, right? This is my thought. Oh, you're thinking that. Well, I could think this, right? In other words, that the I now is pretty big. It includes my body and my feelings and my thinking. When we say it includes, what do we mean? That the patterns of connectivity between the body, the feelings, and the thoughts, I can manage to connect them all together. There's patterns of communicativity in those aspects of brain function. So the I becomes the master. So you can understand that that's what we really want for an adolescent. That you're a master of your body, you're a master of your feelings, and you're a master of your thoughts. That doesn't mean that you're a master in the sense of negative, that you don't involve your body and you try not to have feelings and you only do certain kinds of thoughts. It means that you can make them work. It's about connectivity. Now, what happens in adolescence when, let's say, they're overwhelmed by puberty? So puberty is about body and feelings, and before it's so much about thoughts, so it goes backwards. And so children who are unable to pass puberty, you see, they start to feel that this body and these feelings are not mine. They drive me, but I'm not in the driver's seat. I'm not able to manage to connect it with thinking. And then you say to yourself, well, let's say, how does this, what makes it go? You know, you say, well, we talk to a kid and you say, well, you're angry, right? So how does it switch? What makes it happen that you go from being inside your feelings to becoming the master of your feelings? How does that happen? Kagan's view was based on Piaget. Piaget was based on a clock, it's Swiss, and the idea was it just happens. And so teachers, parents, they have no role whatsoever. And one of the great problems with educators is that, you know, Piaget says, well, what's a stimulus? When you're ready, then the stimulus changes you from, if you remember from swallowing things to coordinating with them. I forget the words exactly because I'm so used to teaching this in Hebrew. It won't help you in Hebrew. But he said it just happens inside of you. It just happens. When you're ready, the stimulus, Swiss clock. And so educators were always wondering, what are we doing here? Huh? Ma? So we're just waiting for the stimulus. You know, I'm standing on the board writing these things and each kid has his own clock. But parallel to Piaget, there was a greater psychologist named Vygotsky. And Vygotsky actually was a Jewish Marxist in the 20s when Marxism was not as bad as it later became. And Vygotsky had the following simple notion. He said, look, you take a child who's able to build a tower of 5 blocks. So you say, well, what's his IQ? 5 blocks, right? But obviously, he can't build 6 by himself. Every time he puts the 6th block, book, falls. So at some point, he'll get to 6. But Vygotsky had the following simple intuition. He said, you know, every mother knows this too, some dads. He may not be able to do it by himself, but when I help him, we get to 6, right? So the I of the baby is 5 blocks. The we of the mother and the baby is 6 blocks. And some children can participate in it, and some children can't. The ones who can participate in it, that's what's important, because that's where they're growing. You see, what you do together with other people, that's the zone of proximal growth. That's the next step in your development, and that's where actually sublimations take place, isn't it? There's something exciting where you sort of experience your future and say, wow, I can do that together with you, then I'll be able to do it. So there's this whole area here of we, which the West was unable to think about, but in Marxism, everything is we, so it's easy to think about, and it's an interesting question what it is in chinuch. Yeah.
I'm just trying to see if I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, if you're a baby and you can build a tower of 5 blocks, right? Well, every time you put the 6th block on, it falls.
Right.
So one way of saying it is 5. That's you. But if you were that baby's dad and you still have the 5 minutes working on the 6, say, let me help you. and together you put the 6 together and it works, you would say, now what is the 6th block? Is it his, or is it mine, or is it ours? The simplest way to say is it's ours, right? Now the baby participates in it and actually gets very excited about it. Why? Because that's his next step in development. And you are helping him to do the next step in development.
What's the next step in development? The fact that he's-
6 blocks. He
Well,
can't,
he can do 6 on his own?
we can do 6. We means
So the
he's part of it.
development is becoming a we, or
There's the sentence, the
So
development
you
of
call
the,
it zone of proximal,
what?
what do you call it, the zone of?
Zone of proximal development,
Okay.
right? The next step, that's easier than zone of proximal development, the next step. So I am helping him to get to the next step. Now, is that next step his or mine? The answer is, it's gonna be his. On the way, it's ours, and it's gonna become his. And that's the child who's on the way and moving.
And that's the proper way to develop, like, let's say in all the developmental stages theories.
You just took off, but yeah, the answer is, that's a very important insight about how we do everything. For example,
You called that scaffolding.
what's that? Scaffolding. Vygotsky refers to as scaffolding. Anybody know Russian? There's a word in Russian for it. I don't know. I didn't read it in Russian. So you see that, now let's say we're doing psychotherapy. Let's say we're doing psychotherapy. And this adolescent is saying, I can't think about my parents. Every time I think about my parents, I stop thinking. Now you could say, okay, that's it. Don't think about your parents, because you can't. Or you could say, well, let's give it a try. For example, and you start to mentalize. You start to mentalize. Now you say to yourself, well, whose mentalization is this? Well, it depends. If the child says, what? Say that again? You mean that? Oh, well, I could, and then you say, well, what do you think? And the child, he starts to think. So you say, oh, mentalization, we're doing it together. It's a scaffolding. That where there isn't ability to continue to develop as an adolescent and do these stitches that an adolescent needs to do, what do we do as a therapist? We do it with them, right? Now, wait a minute, is that a foul? Let's say, psychoanalysis is about going into the deep past, isn't it? So why are we doing the present and the future? And the answer is that psychoanalysis is not for adolescents. No one ever thought that adolescents could do psychoanalysis. They do other things. They can have other forms of therapy, but they can't only go into the past. And what Anna Freud discovered when she started to deal with kids at 5 or 6, she said, I can't go into the past because they haven't had the past yet. They're still in the middle of it. So what are we dealing with? The present, right? So the present, how do we think about the present? Well, we have no role at all in the present, or we have a vital role in the present. But if we have a vital role in the present, how is it his development? It's our development. And the answer is scaffolding. The answer is the next step, that you start to think together with the child or adolescent, and he becomes engaged and starts to become his thinking, right? So to be a therapist is often engaged. Now, when you're doing it with a child who can't do it by himself, so let's say, he comes to class, and he does 5, and you help him, he does 6. You send him home, and he does his homework, he does 5. And the mother says, you didn't learn anything in class, because in class you did 6, and here you can't do 5, it's not yours yet, right? Or you could say, oh, this is what homework is for. Homework is for the next step. In other words, you have a marvelous teacher who did 6 with you, but by yourself you could only do 5. I'm going to do 6 with you also, because that's what adults do with children, because you're on the way. And it's a marvelous thing in class if you've understood some of it in class, and when you go home you say, what was that about? Which is what all of you are going to do with today's class. What? Yeah, well, no. See, you asked the question, we got to the point of what the 6th block meant. And you said, oh, so all of development is about, all of teaching will be about scaffolding. And I said yes, and you said, I don't understand that. All right? So that's what we do. So when your clients are marvelous in the session, they remember it, they've gone 3 steps ahead, something is happening. And they come back the next session and go back to what they were doing before. Do you say, oi gewalt, I was an inaccurate therapist, this was worthless? Or do you say, Of course they lost it. It's not yet theirs. We're going to go back and do it. But how do I know it was there last time? Because I was there with them. They were doing it, right? So he said, it's there. It needs a lot more practice. Scaffolding takes time. Unlike the Swiss clock, that there's a stimulus and boop, it's either there or it's not, which is a poor way to do most things. It's an interesting kind of thought, but the process involved is wrong. The way things really happen is in these gradual kinds of situations, and that's important for therapists, because that's what we do all the time. We're always doing scaffolding, especially with adolescents. Now, there's a couple of questions that came up. One of them is about what on earth is the syllabus about. So the syllabus is playful. In other words, it's meant to tell you, see what it says, basic reading. Basic reading is what we've been doing all along, right? But those of you who have bought Lynn Hoffman are gradually allowing Lynn Hoffman to be your Vygotsky and to stimulate your thinking. You can think with her and you close the book because I didn't understand that. But while you're reading it, it's working. And then most of the classes have reading from these three things, from Hoffman and the two Napier books. But in each section, there were 2 or 3 in bold print. Those are the ones that are in the reader. If they're in the reader, the idea is you're supposed to read it. That's what a reader is for. But we know that you may be doing it sometime in further development. But that's what the reader is for. And sometimes we'll be using it more, and sometimes we'll be using it less. For example, if you look at the next topic, which is conflict, number 9, so there's 2 chapters of Lynn Hoffman, and at the bottom you'll see it says Napier Crucible, chapter 10. That's in bold print. That means in the family crucible, we're going to be referring to what happened with the Bryce family in chapter 10. And for the next several sections, we're going to be picking up the Bryce family again, in case you've forgotten who they are. Is that clear enough for now so you can forget it when you go home? And then write it again on the blog, and until it becomes yours. 2 other points. Yes. The videos. We have a very interesting situation with the videos, which is, you'll find this in other Haredi institutions as well. There's a question about how to deal with the internet, how to keep it clean, but how to keep it fast. And Neve, not the Family Institute, Neve has not solved that problem yet, so they changed to some new way of doing things, and every time a video is being uploaded, it's like trauma. It overwhelms the broadband, and so all the other computers can't think. So all the computers go down. So this is something that we're going to be discussing with Neve shortly, so we can find a way that we can upload them. But there's been a serious problem with that. It was suggested to Chavi she simply do it at midnight. That wasn't so helpful, so we're trying to solve. But she's on it, and we're trying to solve it. And the last thing is, hopefully in the next week or 2, we will complete all of the formal application to the Agudah. The Agudah is, the Israel Couples and Families Association. It's been taking a bit of time because it's a Hebrew process, and our staff is not so adept necessarily in Hebrew, and it means going back until more or less kindergarten and who you had supervision with, and all sorts of things like that. And so it's a very unfriendly proposition, which we're doing with a smile. That kind of a smile. So, but hopefully we're about to be finished with it, and then the application will go to the Agudah, and hopefully in the next month or 2 they'll be able to tell us where we're holding. I'm still, this has been hard for us, but it has nothing to do with the Agudah. When they get it, we just need to help them to say yes. That's the scaffolding that we're working on carefully, but that's where we're standing now, and I'm hopeful that when they do accredit us, that they'll accredit this year as part of accrediting us. And any reason why they should start from next September, we started now, and that's the request. But more news when there is news. Now, we're going to break into the small groups and work on thinking as adolescents. And next week we're going on to the next unit, which is about conflict. What? 2 weeks, next session, right. So Poor,
Oh, it's poor.
poor is about conflict. You don't need a lesson. Just read the Megillah and have a good drink, and you'll know all about conflict. And in 2 weeks we'll do.
Wait, is there a class?
What?
Next Wednesday, is there a class?